Hello, you're watching A News. My name is Tim Tongana, live from Baku. Welcome to the program. Let's take a look at the headlines. The US says it is preparing the toughest sanctions ever imposed on Iran, escalating economic pressure on Tehran. Leaders in Europe are demanding Israel halt its latest settlement project on the West Bank. And Venezuelan and Cuban migrants deported from the US arrive in Liberia under a new deal with Washington. All right, we begin here. Washington says it is preparing its toughest ever sanctions against Iran following President Trump's threat of economic warfare. The move comes as oil prices rise and Tehran disputes US claims over shipping through the Strait of Hormuz.
US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says Washington will impose what he described as the toughest sanctions in history on Iran. He says maximum economic pressure could reduce the need for further major military action. Speaking to CNBC on Thursday, Bessent said the measures would complement the US naval blockade imposed on Iran in April. He said details of the sanctions package would be announced at a news conference on Monday. The comments followed President Donald Trump's threat of economic warfare against Iran and countries that provide Tehran with any form of support. Trump defended the policy, saying preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons was the central aim of the operation. Oil prices rose to their highest level in more than 3 weeks after the US warnings, as markets assess the impact of the conflict on Middle Eastern oil supplies. Washington says the measures are intended to weaken Iran's government. Tehran, however, has accused the US of spreading misinformation about shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's state news agency IRNA says traffic through the waterway remains limited and is restricted to routes controlled by Tehran. It also accused Washington of trying to ease pressure on global crude prices and US petrol prices ahead of the midterm elections. Meanwhile, Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia says Moscow will not pressure Iran to resume negotiations with Washington. He says Tehran should decide its own course as a sovereign state.
Meanwhile, Iran has condemned what it calls the escalation in US economic and trade sanctions, vowing to stand firm in its defending its interests. A News correspondent Turaj Shiralilu reports from Tehran.
Iran's foreign ministry has condemned the latest U.S. economic and trade sanctions against Tehran, describing the measures as economic terrorism and crimes against humanity. In a statement, the ministry said Iran remains determined to protect its national security and interests, despite what it called continued U.S. military, economic, political, and psychological pressure. Tehran also linked the new sanctions to the anniversary of the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran, saying they reflect decades of hostility by successive U.S. administrations. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi separately criticized the measures on X, responding to U.S. President Donald Trump's description of the sanctions as an economic D-Day. Araghchi said Washington's continued reliance on what he called failed pressure policies would only lead to further defeat and deepen tensions with the Iranian people. He also warned that U.S. economic measures against Iran threaten the global economy and national sovereignty worldwide. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Now let's bring in a political analyst, James Dorsey, joining us from Singapore to discuss the latest on the US-Iran conflict. Mr. Dorsey, hello and welcome back to A News.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so is Trump's new sanction strategy actually designed to force Iran to negotiate this increasingly aggressive language I'm sure you've seen from the president's statement of the US? Could this be counterproductive, or is Washington now openly pursuing regime collapse?
Well, it's by definition counterproductive. We've clearly seen that the Iranians repeatedly have said that they want to see a measure of what they call respect, that they want to see a measure of moderate language being used rather than the kind of threats. And history shows that Iran, under pressure, tends to harden its position rather than become more flexible. I think on top of this, the problem is, as so often with President Trump, as well as in this case, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, that their statements raise as many questions as they provide answers. It's not clear who is going to give that press conference on Monday. It's also not clear what these measures include. If they are measures focused on third countries dealing with Iran, we're talking primarily about Turkey, Russia, and China, which are all unlikely to cave into Trump's demands. On top of that, the question is what those sanctions would entail. At this point, the only thing one can think of, or two things one can think of, is harking back to a February executive order by Trump, which imposed 25% tariffs on all goods and services entering the United States from countries that do business with Iran, or the imposition of sanctions on entities, third country entities and individuals. For example, companies, ports, airports, refineries.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that whenever tough actions are brought against Iran, they seem to not move on their positions. So if sanctions have failed to force Tehran then to concede after years of maximum pressure, what makes Washington believe any tougher campaigns will produce a different outcome?
Trump believes that time is on his side, perhaps for the first time in this conflict. He believes that more oil is going through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Omani territorial waters. It's not, according to estimates of trade intelligence firms, it's up to 40% of what originally went through the Strait of Hormuz prior to the war. He also believes that Iran is economically on its last legs. And of course, that you've seen the global energy markets, some of the major purchasers or buyers move away from Persian Gulf oil because of the problems. The problem with all of this is that if Trump is right, and he could be right, then what this creates is an opportunity for a negotiation rather than an opportunity to defeat Iran. And by positioning himself the way he is in the United States, the way Trump is positioning the country, he's missing that opportunity. The other side of the coin is that the Iranians believe that time is on their side. They see the forthcoming midterm elections in the United States, the lack of public support for the war, rising oil prices, low oil reserves, and of course the fact that what Trump has messaged to Iran and to the globe is that he wants to avert a return to a military confrontation. And that's why that may be the best of bad alternatives that Iran has.
So Trump is also threatening countries that continue doing business with Iran. Is the U.S. now risking turning an Iran conflict into a much broader confrontation with its own economic partners?
Well, it already has issues with its own economic partners, even though the issue, okay, there are two issues here. One is the countries that really count in terms of supporting or dealing with Iran. And that's primarily Turkey, a NATO ally, and Russia and China. We've already heard the Russians and the Chinese, for all practical matters, reject Trump's demand. It's highly likely that the same will be true for Turkey. And then you have, of course, the rest of the U.S. allies, Europe, Canada, Australia. It's hard to see that they're going to participate in sanctioning of Iran, given that they were opposed to this war from day one.
So I'm glad you mentioned allies like China and Russia. China in particular, we know that it buys a substantial share of Iran's oil. And we know, as you alluded to, the fact that Beijing has rejected these unilateral sanctions. How far can China be prepared to go to protect its energy relationship with Tehran?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that China recently has reduced by half its oil imports. Moreover, China has alternative sources for oil. So this is not going to affect China in terms of its oil security. China will back politically and diplomatically Iran in its fight with the United States, but it's unlikely to go any further than that.
So then, could this move by the U.S. inadvertently push Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow into a much deeper strategic alignment, even though you say Beijing no longer heavily relies on Iran's oil?
It's a question that keeps being repeated every time something happens or there's some development. So far, it's not been the case. And there's no reason, at least in my mind, why this would be pushing China, Russia, and Iran closer than they already are.
You claim that Washington wants perhaps another coin to what Trump is trying to do, could be trying to bring them back into the negotiating table. But with the U.S. already pushing military and economic pressure on Tehran, what practical military options does Washington still have if sanctions fail to bring Iran to the negotiating table?
The options are getting smaller and smaller, basically. Essentially, what the United States should be doing is, if Trump is correct with his assessment that time is on his side and that he has leverage, he should be using that leverage to create an environment that's conducive to a serious negotiation. That would imply use of a different language. It would also imply trying to create the circumstances in which he, on the one hand, can achieve his core goals, which are free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, as well as guarantees that Iran will not be able to develop a nuclear weapon, while at the same time giving Iran the incentives that would help to bring it to the table and to allow it to make compromises.
So then, is Trump trying to create leverage through psychological pressure, essentially convincing Iranians on the ground and Iran's economic partners that the cost of continuing this war will perhaps become unbearable at some point?
There's a red line that goes through Iran's approach to the Iran conflict from day one, which is the belief that he has the power, that the United States has the power to force Iran on its knees and to cave in to his demands. Iran hasn't caved in. On the contrary, it's hardened its demands. And as long as Trump believes that, in other words, that negotiations are about an Iranian surrender rather than a give and take process in which there is mutual agreement on various issues. As long as Trump believes that, there's not going to be he's going to have lesser options, and there's not going to be a resolution of this conflict.
Now, looking ahead to Monday, to those announcements by the U.S., ultimately, what is the end goal here? Is it a negotiated settlement, like you alluded to on one coin? Is it Iranian surrender, even though you claim that they stand firm on their positions whenever Washington becomes hard on them? Or is it regime change, or is it Washington at risk of entering a conflict to no clear strategy and no clear end in sight?
Some of those goals are not in conflict with one another. So the risk of the United States entering into a conflict with no end in sight is a distinct possibility. It's not something that Iran can afford or want. And therefore, maybe one reason why potentially it could escalate in the hope that it de-escalates. In terms of what Trump wants, he's repeatedly said that he wants Iran to surrender, that he wants Iran to raise the white flag. and that he wants Iran to accept his demands as he makes them. And that's not something that's going to happen.
All right, thank you so much for your time. James Dorsey, a political analyst from Singapore.
Thank you for having me.
Washington isn't just hitting Iran with sanctions. It has also announced new measures against its ally Hezbollah. It's accused the Lebanese armed group of cash smuggling and sanctions evasions. Here's more on the story.
The United States has imposed fresh sanctions on Hezbollah, accusing the Lebanese group of acting on behalf of Iran's government and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The U.S. Treasury Department also sanctioned 10 people accused of moving large sums of cash for Hezbollah. Washington says a Turkey-based businessman ran a network using exchange houses, companies and bank accounts to transfer money between countries in the region and Hezbollah's stronghold in Lebanon. The latest measures allow the U.S. to freeze assets and restrict financial transactions involving those targeted. Washington first designated Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization in 1997 and has maintained sanctions against the group since then. The move comes as the Trump administration has threatened tougher economic action against Iran and other countries accused of supporting it. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says he will announce next week what he described as the toughest sanctions in history planned for Iran. Hezbollah has long-standing military and political ties with Iran. Lebanon's government has been pushing for the group to disarm, saying decisions on war and peace should rest with the state.
After the break, leaders in Europe demand Israel halt its new settlement project in the occupied West Bank as tenders open to build 1,200 new homes. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching A News. Now, some leading nations in Europe and Canada have condemned plans by Israel to start a major new construction project on the West Bank. Palestinians have argued the E1 housing development will cut the West Bank into two, isolating East Jerusalem.
Israel's plans to open tenders for about 1,200 settlement homes in the strategically important E1 area of the occupied West Bank have drawn fresh condemnation from major Western powers. The UK, France, Germany, Italy and Canada called the decision unacceptable and urged Israel to withdraw the plans immediately. The 5 countries said the move could further undermine hopes for a two-state solution. E1 lies east of Jerusalem, and Palestinians and many of Israel's allies have warned that construction there could effectively cut the West Bank in two and isolate East Jerusalem. US Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee has warned Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank not to take property owned by Palestinian Americans.
And I think if we're going to be true to faith, true to heritage, then you recognize that if you don't own something, you don't take it and you don't desire it. So if someone owns the land and they own their house, then having someone come and take it over and scare the family away from it, that's a violation not just of man's law, that's a violation of God's law, and it should be called out as such.
The United Nations has also warned that the plan poses an existential threat to the territorial continuity of a future Palestinian state. In Gaza, the UN says Palestinian civilians, including children, continue to be killed and injured in Israeli airstrikes. UN spokesperson Stephane Dujarric said the bodies of 50 people, including 19 children, killed more than 2 years ago, were recently recovered from the rubble and buried.
Our colleagues at the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs continue to receive reports of Palestinian civilians in Gaza being killed, being injured or otherwise impacted by Israeli airstrikes, by shelling and gunfire. This includes children, as one can imagine given the overcrowded conditions in the Gaza Strip. We continue to call for the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Civilians should never be targeted or used for military purposes.
The UN says recovery work is being slowed by restrictions on machinery and supplies, while 94% of Gaza's 2.1 million people need shelter and basic assistance.
Now, as Turkey steps up its role in Syria, its growing involvement is drawing attention from Israel. The latest developments are adding another layer of tensions between the two countries over the future of Syria. Adam Morrow reports from Istanbul.
Turkey says it will continue supporting Syria's efforts to bolster its military capacity and rebuild its defense infrastructure, despite steadily mounting tensions with Israel over Ankara's role in the country. Speaking at a Thursday press briefing, a defense ministry spokesman said Turkish support would continue under what Ankara calls the One Army principle, which is aimed at strengthening Syrian state institutions, including its armed forces. The remarks came 2 days after Israeli warplanes struck the Abu al-Duhur military airbase in northwestern Syria near the Turkish border, damaging the runway and other facilities, but causing no reported casualties. Israel says the strike was carried out because Syria was preparing to allow Turkish forces to establish a presence at the base, a move that Israel views as a threat to its security. But the Turkish Defense Ministry rejected the claim, saying no Turkish military personnel had been present at the airbase either before or during the Israeli attack. Syria, too, has denied that any Turkish military buildup was planned at the facility. The incident has led to increasingly sharp exchanges between Turkey and Israel, with Ankara accusing Israel of violating Syria's sovereignty and undermining efforts to stabilize the country. Israel, for its part, has repeatedly warned against any expansion of Turkish military influence in Syria. The dispute comes as Turkey deepens cooperation with Syria's new leadership following the fall of President Bashar al-Assad in late 2024. Since Assad's departure, Ankara has been providing Syria with military training and technical support, while also expanding economic, trade, and energy ties with Damascus. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Romania has destroyed a maritime drone armed with explosives after it detected close to a major Black Sea gas project. 2 F-16 fighter jets were scrambled after the UAV was spotted just a few hundred meters from the Neptune Deep development. Several hundred employees were working on the site at the time. Anita Shammer has more on the story.
Welcome to this day in Europe, where Romania destroyed an explosive-laden marine drone close to one of the EU's most important new energy projects. Romania scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets after the drone was spotted just 100 meters from the Neptune Deep gas project in the Black Sea. The site lies within Romania's exclusive economic zone, but outside its territorial waters, meaning an attack there would not automatically fall within NATO's collective defense provisions. Defense Minister Radu Miruța says the drone was hit by a fighter jet, then completely destroyed by a ship sent to the area. He later confirmed it was carrying explosives. Now, this is not an isolated incident. Earlier this month, Romanian military divers destroyed 2 other drones drifting near the project. And just days ago, 2 Spanish F-18 fighter jets shot down a drone that entered Romanian airspace, following 3 Russian drones shot down on 3 consecutive days in July. Romania has not identified where the latest drone came from, but Ukraine says it was not theirs, and the Romanian president blames Russia, condemning what he calls an intensification of irresponsible incidents by Moscow. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the latest incident is part of an escalating campaign of threats. Russia has not commented. The location also matters. Neptune Deep is expected to begin producing gas next year and could make Romania the EU's largest gas producer. Jointly owned by OMV Petrom and state-owned Romgaz, the project is an important part of Europe's efforts to strengthen its energy security. Miruța says Romania is on the front line of the EU's defense, facing threats not only from drones at sea and in the air, but also from floating mines in the Black Sea. Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey are working closely together to clear those mines, with more than 150 neutralized since the war in Ukraine started. For Romania and its NATO allies, the war is increasingly posing a threat not only to their airspace and waters, but also to critical energy infrastructure. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Now, at least 16 people have been killed and dozens injured in a Russian overnight air assault on Kyiv and surrounding areas. Ukraine says civilian sites were hit. It is calling for stronger air defenses. Moscow says it targeted military facilities only.
A day of mourning has been declared for Friday in Ukraine after at least a dozen people were killed in a large-scale Russian missile and drone attack overnight in Kyiv and the surrounding area. That's according to the capital's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko. Officials say more than 40 others were injured. Ukrainian authorities said the strikes damaged apartment buildings, warehouses, a school and a children's hospital across several districts of the capital. The country's air force said Russia launched dozens of hypersonic missiles, including ballistic, and 168 drones. Officials said many were intercepted, but ballistic ones remained a major challenge. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has renewed calls for Western allies to provide more air defense missiles, particularly Patriot interceptors, saying shortages are leaving the capital vulnerable to ballistic attacks. Russia's defense ministry said the latest strikes targeted military facilities, including sites producing drone components, a military depot and a logistics hub. Separately, Russia and Ukraine exchanged 103 prisoners each in a United Arab Emirates-mediated swap, with the released Russian servicemen transferred to Belarus for medical assistance.
Meanwhile, at least 2 people have been killed and 2 others injured in a Russian drone attack on Ukraine's Kharkiv region. The overnight strike hit the village of Lviadze, where 5 homes and several cars were damaged and fires broke out. Rescuers recovered the bodies of 2 women from the rubble. Russian strikes also hit the Sumy region, causing fires, damage to residential areas, and further injuries. Ukraine's president is calling on the U.S. and other allies to approve the sale of Patriot interceptors after the attack on Kyiv. Volodymyr Zelensky says Patriots remain Ukraine's principal defense against Russian ballistic missiles.
The strike was a combined one, and there were a lot of ballistics, cruise missiles, drones. Unfortunately, ballistics are the most difficult now to intercept. Whether the percentage of interception of cruise missiles is close to 90%, the situation with ballistic missiles is much worse. We need interceptors for Patriots. This is something only our partners can provide. On all levels, we convey to them our needs and our understanding that they have the resources to meet them.
Russia says it sees little prospect of progress toward a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine conflict under Kyiv's current position, according to Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. He says the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are always welcome in Russia, but no dates are set for any visit.
At the moment, given the position of the Kyiv regime, there are no grounds for optimism regarding a peaceful settlement. The developments on the front lines are well known. The special military operation continues. We highly value the efforts of all countries that are sincerely seeking to contribute to the settlement process.
Petrol supplies ran out at 7 out of 10 stations on Wednesday, according to monitoring groups. Queues have been forming at pumps across Moscow amid reports that Russia has brought back a previously banned low-grade fuel to plug the gap. Authorities have imposed limits across much of the country, with major stations capping the amount that can be purchased by motorists on a single visit. Russian President Vladimir Putin has acknowledged these shortages, but described them as non-critical. Meanwhile, Russian president's visit to the disputed islands of Iturup has reignited tensions with Japan and sent a broader message about Russia's growing confrontation with the West in the Asia-Pacific. Moscow says the island status is settled, while Tokyo continues to claim it is part of its northern territories. But analysts say the visit was about more than the territorial dispute, signaling to Japan, the United States and the wider region that Russia is prepared to project its power in the Pacific.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Iturup Island, known in Japan as Etorofu, was presented as a routine trip to Russian territory. But the visit carried wider political and strategic significance. Although former President Dmitry Medvedev had been there previously, this was Putin's first visit to the island. When Shinzo Abe was Prime Minister of Japan, Moscow and Tokyo discussed returning 2 of the 4 disputed islands and creating a joint economic zone with visa-free travel. Those efforts collapsed after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Today, Moscow sees no ambiguity over the island's status, while Japan continues to claim it as part of what it calls its northern territories. The dispute has again led to diplomatic tension, including critical statements and the summoning of ambassadors. Political analyst Seijiro Takeshito say Putin's visit also had a domestic political purpose.
A lower house election coming up very soon in Russia. So I think he has to really make the image, create the identity that he will not fall back with this, against the strength of these, free world alliance. So, it's almost like a propaganda movement that he's making.
Since 2022, Japan has joined the G7's position on Ukraine. It imposed sanctions on Russia and expanded military cooperation with the United States and other regional partners. From Moscow's perspective, Japan has shifted from a difficult but pragmatic neighbor to part of the Western security structure that opposes Russia. Tokyo, however, says its military buildup is mainly intended to counter China's growing military power. Japan plans to raise defense spending to 2% of gross domestic product while expanding its missile capabilities. Political analyst Dmitry Bridze says the growing reach of Japan's military systems is increasing risks in the region.
An adversary missile launch infrastructure hundreds or thousands of kilometers away can be described legally as defensive if it's used to respond to an attack, but operationally it represents a substantial power projection capability. So therefore, the situation also becoming dangerous for all the region if there will be any military tensions.
Japan's stronger military ties with Washington, as well as regional arrangements involving the United States, the UK and Australia, have added to Moscow's concerns. Russia also views Tokyo's political and military support for Kyiv as part of a wider anti-Russian alignment. Moscow's response, analysts say, is intended not only for Japan but also for the United States, South Korea, Taiwan and China. Andrei Kolobkov says the visit sends a particular message to Washington as Russia's ties with China continue to deepen.
For Trump, preventing any kind of alliance between fully-fledged real alliance between China and Russia was one of the core goals of his foreign policy from the very start. He would have wanted to have some kind of alliance between the United States and Russia against China. Now, this is unachievable, but Putin is sending signals that he might still be working in this direction.
Further joint exercises involving Russia, China and North Korea could add pressure on Japan and its allies. The Iturup dispute is now part of a wider contest for influence in the Asia-Pacific, where tensions between Russia, China and the Western alliance continue to grow.
A landslide at a gold mine in southwestern Colombia has killed 13 workers and injured 7 others. The collapse on Wednesday was initially thought to be an explosion, but authorities later said mining activity had been destabilized surrounding slopes. Rescue teams worked through the night to recover the victims, with all those reported missing found by early Thursday. Dozens of vehicles and passengers have been stranded on a coastal highway in the south of Peru for a fourth day after heavy rain triggered mudslides. Traffic is at a standstill in both directions on parts of the Pan-American Highway South. Road links between cities have been cut, with trucks, buses and cars stuck along a 10-kilometer stretch. Municipal workers are distributing emergency food and water to drivers and passengers. Soldiers are helping to clear mud from the road. Authorities have not said anything about the highway and when it will reopen. Chile's president has visited the city of Tocopilla after floods and mudslides caused major damage. Around 60% of homes in the city were affected. More than 1,000 people have been moved to shelters across the region. Army and Navy personnel are clearing streets of mud and debris. Volunteers are also helping with the cleanup. Authorities say there have been no deaths. However, the warning system failed to issue timely alerts as water levels rose rapidly. Tocopilla is located on a narrow coastal strip surrounded by ravines. Now, the Trump administration has sent the first group of deportees to Liberia under a deal allowing Washington to transfer up to 1,200 people to West Africa's state over the next year. Liberia's information minister said most of those deported are from Latin American countries, including Venezuela, Cuba and Colombia. The arrangement is part of the Trump administration's efforts to speed up deportations by sending some people to third countries. The UN Refugee Agency and migration officials are helping provide support for the operation, which Washington has defended as lawful. The fallout from the mass migrant crossing into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta last month is influencing Europe's forthcoming partnership agreement with Morocco. Brussels is now reportedly preparing more support for border management as it seeks to conclude the deal by the end of the year.
The Ceuta crisis has strengthened Morocco's hand in its negotiations with the European Union. According to Euronews, Brussels is preparing to increase resources for security, migration and border management as it works towards a new strategic partnership with Rabat. EU officials reportedly denied that the Ceuta crisis accelerated negotiations. They say the agreement, which is largely about migration, was already expected by the end of this year. But they acknowledge migration surge has prompted Brussels to increase resources dedicated to border and migration management. A European Commission spokesperson told Euronews that the EU committed €222 million for migration management in Morocco between 2021 and 2024, with another €190 million foreseen through 2027. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also called for tighter checks, physical barriers and improved technical and financial support for Morocco. The Ceuta crisis came after more than 72,000 people crossed into the Spanish enclave irregularly at the end of July. Dozens of people were killed. Meanwhile, Spain is building temporary accommodation in Ceuta, with 4 sites planned to provide space for up to 1,500 people as existing reception centres struggle with overcrowding.
Dozens of victims of one of Nigeria's deadliest recent boat disasters have been buried in the northwestern state of Sokoto. At least 50 people, many of them children, were killed when an overloaded boat capsized in the Goronyo area. The bodies were taken to a local mosque ahead of the burial. Residents say the boat was carrying farmers and workers who were traveling to harvest rice. There are different accounts of how many people were on board. One eyewitness said there were more than 70, while another put the number at around 57. All right, after the break, we'll look at more stories shaping the region. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching A News. Now, the United Kingdom and Azerbaijan are working to formalize their new strategic partnership. That's according to the newly appointed UK ambassador to Azerbaijan. The agreement will cover political, economic, and defense ties between the two countries. Ambassador Duncan Norman also says the UK has strengthened cooperation with its first resident defense attaché, in Baku over a year.
It's a really important thing for the defence relationship. It's also, of course, very new. And like every new relationship, you have to start small and let it grow. And that's what we're doing. But we're already providing training opportunities in the UK. We're providing more, looking at what help and support we can provide in country as well. And we're talking about how we might be able to help with, in the future, with equipment and supplies and those sort of things in the future. But it's new, but I think it's really exciting. And I think it's something that over the next 3 to 4 years will really grow. And I think I see it as one of the growth areas in our relationship during my time here.
The Armenian government has approved its development program for the next 5 years. The document includes concrete plans for signing a peace agreement with Azerbaijan, delimiting the border and developing transport links. At the same time, Yerevan plans to modernize its armed forces and strengthen its military capabilities in the coming years.
Armenia's new 5-year development program places particular emphasis on relations with Azerbaijan. The document says work will continue towards signing and ratifying a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as the delimitation and demarcation of the state border. It also plans to expand ties between the two countries' civil societies and business communities, as well as bilateral trade. Regional transport projects are also highlighted in the program. Armenia plans to implement the Crossroads of Peace initiative and rebuild the Gyumri-Akurik and Yeresk-Sadarak railway sections. The document also calls for greater dialogue with Azerbaijan and Turkey in the energy sector. At the same time, the Armenian government has identified the development of its armed forces as another priority for the next 5 years. The program calls for continued efforts to transition to a professional army, increase the number of military personnel, and strengthen the armed forces' supply of weapons, military equipment, and other resources. It also envisages the digital transformation of the military command and control system, aligning military education institutions with Western standards and expanding domestic military production. In foreign policy, Armenia plans to deepen its strategic partnerships with the European Union and the United States, while transforming its relationship with Russia in line with a new foreign policy context. The program also includes plans to draft a new constitution and put it to a referendum. Overall, the document shows that Armenia plans to pursue peace and regional integration with Azerbaijan while simultaneously strengthening its defense capabilities over the next 5 years.
Now, an international conference is underway here in Baku, focusing on Belgium's colonial legacy in Central Africa and calls for repatriations and historic justice. Our correspondent Chimnaz Ashala has the latest from the program.
Colonialism is once again in the spotlight in Baku as an international conference on Belgium's colonial legacy and the fight for reparation is currently underway. Belgium's colonial rule left a deep and lasting impact on Central Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo was under Belgian colonial rule for around 75 years, while Rwanda and Burundi were also administered by Belgium during the colonial periods. Today, decades after independence, questions of historical responsibility, recognition and reparative justice remain part of international discussions. Organized by the Baku Initiative Group, the conference brings together officials and experts from Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Morocco and South Africa, as well as representatives from the United Nations. The focus is on Belgium's historical responsibility for the crimes committed during the colonial era, with participants discussing calls for an official apology, reparation and the restitution of cultural heritage. The conference is also addressing demand for greater access to Belgium's colonial archives, the return of human remains and historical artifacts, and the establishment of international mechanism to ensure reparations. Discussions are continuing here in Baku, with participants calling for historical justice and concrete steps toward addressing the legacy of Belgian colonial rule. I'm Chimnaz Shahlar with Zimrab Shirinov for A News.
Central Asia is stepping up efforts to expand its transport links, with billions of dollars being invested in new railway, roads and logistics hubs. The projects are also reshaping major trade routes between Asia and Europe, with Kazakhstan playing a central role. Our correspondent Fariza Karmuzina has more.
Kazakhstan has become the biggest investor in transport projects among Central Asian countries. It accounts for 45% of all regional investment in roads and railways, around $32 billion. That's according to a new report by the Eurasian Development Bank. Overall, Central Asian countries are investing almost $72 billion in transport projects. The biggest share goes to railways, more than 42%. But countries across the region are also building and upgrading roads, logistics centers and border crossings. Kazakhstan's geography puts it right at the heart of many of these routes. Major transport links running through the country connect China with Russia and the South Caucasus, and that strengthens Kazakhstan's position as a key transit country between East and West. China remains the largest foreign investor in Central Asia's transport sector. According to the Eurasian Development Bank, Chinese investment exceeds $7 billion. And many of these projects are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And looking ahead, the Eurasian Development Bank says these routes could become much better connected by 2035, and with its location, level of investment and growing transit role, Kazakhstan is expected to remain a key part of that development. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Uzbekistan and Georgia have introduced an electronic payment system for international road freight, replacing paper documents with digital permits. The move is expected to speed up procedures and make cross-border transport more transparent, with more than 60% of Uzbek road carriers currently using routes through Georgia. Civil Rajapova reports from Tashkent.
Uzbekistan and Georgia have launched the e-permit system for international road freight. The system will allow carriers to receive transport permits electronically instead of using paper documents. It covers bilateral and transit transportation, as well as shipments to and from third countries. Uzbekistan's transport ministry says the digital system will reduce paperwork and the human factor, while helping prevent delays in the permit process. The change is particularly significant for Uzbek carriers, with over 60% of the country's road transport companies currently operating through Georgia. The electronic exchange of permits is expected to save time and provide carriers with a more transparent and convenient system. The agreement to introduce e-permit was signed during President Shavkat Mirziyoyev's visit to Georgia in early July. The two countries also agreed to expand discounts on rail freight and develop logistics infrastructure at Georgian seaports. The goal is to make the transport routes through Georgia more efficient and strengthen Uzbekistan's access to international trade corridors. Cyril Rajab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Kyrgyzstan, China and Russia are now Georgia's leading export markets, according to the latest trade figures. The data also points to Tbilisi's growing importance along the middle corridor. Nini Nikolashvili reports from Tbilisi.
The headline number: Kyrgyzstan is now Georgia's largest single export market at $521 million, ahead of China and Russia. That's not random. It reflects the middle corridor, the route moving goods from Central Asia and China through Georgia and the South Caucasus toward Europe, bypassing both Russia and Iran. As global trade reroutes around sanctions and instability, Georgia is positioning itself as a transit and re-export hub. And these expert figures suggest that strategy is gaining real traction. But the same data holds a harder story. Russia is Georgia's third largest export destination and second largest trading partner overall, with turnover of $1.8 billion. That's substantial economic cooperation with a country Georgia has had no formal diplomatic ties with since 2008. And it comes as Tbilisi's relationship with the EU and US remains strained over democratic backsliding concerns and Georgia's own geopolitical alignment. Beyond partners, overall trade turnover climbed to $15.5 billion, up 7.5%, driven largely by a 21.6% jump in exports. Cars and oil products dominate trade in both directions. Together, the figures paint a picture of a country economically pulled in multiple directions at once, chasing middle corridor opportunity while staying commercially close to Russia. The trade numbers, in that sense, tell a foreign policy story as much as an economic one. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A News.
All right, that's it for this hour. Thank you for joining me, Tim Tongana, and the A News team behind the scenes. Stay tuned to all our streaming platforms on YouTube and the A News website, and follow us on all our social media pages. Goodbye.